Hi everyone, welcome to Born Accessible Workflows with eBOUND. I'm Sahiba and I'm here with my colleague Elizabeth. Elizabeth, you can start.
Perfect. Great. Thank you for joining us today. So I'm just going to give us a brief overview about eBOUND, what we do, and what we're going to go over today. So eBOUND Canada, we help publishers engage in the digital marketplace, and we represent 83 independent Canadian publishers across the country. So what we do, so we have four main areas. So ebook creation. So we offer ebook conversion services as well as recommend conversion partners that you could work with. We have digital asset management, distribution and marketing, and also research and education. So we offer PD sessions and training, as you can see right now that we're working with Books BC on this presentation. So for today, we're going to go over Born Accessible workflows. We're going to go through some resources to help you create your Born Accessible workflow. We're going to talk about the Benetech Certification, and we're going to hear directly from a publisher about their experience in creating a Born Accessible workflow. So I'm going to pass it back to Saiba to kick it off.
Thank you. Okay, so for Born Accessible Workflows, we're going to go over the definition of what a Born Accessible book is, and then we will take a look at an overview of in-house EPUB production, and then we will discuss quality assurance of completed ebooks. So what is a Born Accessible book? It's an ebook that is accessible from day one and does not have to be remediated post-production to include accessibility features. Some examples of accessibility features include alt text for images, page break markers, and page lists, and reading order and structural navigation. I think it's a good point. This is a good point for us to ask how many of you are familiar with EPUB accessibility features. You can put it in the chat and we can take a look. Or you can reply with an emoji on your screen. And if you're not familiar, I'm going to be discussing some resources later on that are great for learning more about accessible publishing. Okay, I'm seeing in the chat, yes, we are. Our production folks manage it, however. Okay, interesting. Yes, it's also some publishers, we know that they work with third-party vendors for their ebook production. And that's part of their workflow as well. Okay. All right, so Born Accessible workflow. Wait, I see something in the chat. I'm a designer. I would like to consider accessibility from the start. Awesome. So where does accessibility start? With in-house production, it can begin right from the editorial stage, where you can create image descriptions and implement word styles. And then moving on to the design and layout phase, where you can further add accessibility through embedded styles, alt text, creating a table of contents, and exporting the file to the correct format. And then lastly, post-export, you can make sure that the EPUB meets conformance requirements, and you can include accessibility metadata as well. So for the editorial or manuscript stage, it's a great place to start with image descriptions. Some guidelines include preferably creating the descriptions through the author or the editor, or if not, then a subject matter expert, as they know the content well. And then describing all non-decorative images, using present tense and a clear structure, and being concise, objective, and uncensored. And you can use word styles in Microsoft Word to mark headings, block quotes, citations, and distinguish between emphasized and italicized text and strong versus bold. And you can also mark up lists. Later on, we'll discuss the Accessible Publishing Learning Network, where you can find links to a downloadable word style template, as well as a literary image description best practices guide. And for the design and layout stage, I think the industry standard is InDesign for ebook layout. Here you can apply HTML tags to paragraph and character styles. You can start embedding alt text to all non-decorative images, and you can set up a table of contents using proper heading structure. And when you're exporting, you have the option of exporting either as reflowable or fixed layout EPUB. For reflowable, you can choose EPUB 3.3, which is the latest, most accessible EPUB version that accommodates the accessibility features and works well with assistive technology. And then post-export, with the EPUB itself, you can conform to the latest conformance specs, such as WCAG 2.2 or Web Content Accessibility Guidelines and EPUB Accessibility 1.1 spec. And if you're a certified publisher or have gone through the Benetech's GCA program or the Global Certified Accessible program, you can check for that compliance as well. And then, of course, this is also the stage where you add accessibility metadata. You can add it in the EPUB itself with schema.org metadata, as well as in Onyx. So for schema.org accessibility metadata, schema.org is basically a standards body for online accessibility or EPUB accessibility, and you can it's basically a set of properties used to identify the accessible qualities of a publication. And the 5 main properties for schema.org for an EPUB are access mode sufficient, the accessibility summary, accessibility features, and accessibility hazards. The access mode property is basically used to describe how people can perceive the information or content of a book. For example, textual is a value you can put here, or visual if the book contains a lot of images, or is, for example, a fixed layout book. And then access mode sufficient is a property that refers to the way that someone can access all of the content or information in a book. So it combines all of the different access modes, for example, textual or visual. And then accessibility features are, of course, for example, alt text or print page numbers, or now it's the value is page break markers, table of contents, etc. And then hazards are things like if the book has, for example, interactive features or multimedia like videos, and if there's a hazard such as flashing or stimulation, this is also where you indicate that in the metadata. And then Onyx is an XML-based file that's distributed alongside a book or ebook. I think most publishers are familiar with Onyx. It contains all kinds of metadata about a book, such as the title, author, edition, page count, and accessibility features as well, or accessibility details. So Onyx has a set of code lists that make up the standard, and code list 196 lists the e-publication accessibility details. And if you're Benetech certified, you can also include your certification compliance metadata in Onyx, as well as the internal EPUB metadata. And then after you have a well-formed accessible EPUB, you can complete a final quality assurance check. And some features that, or some items that you can check for are things such as obviously alt text for images, whether you've marked up language shifts throughout the ebook, the correct heading order, if you have accessibility metadata, if you have backlinks for footnotes or endnotes, and you have to make sure you don't have inline styling, ensure that even decorative images are marked up with alt equals no value and then role equals presentation, and whether you have descriptive title elements. So these are just some things you can check for, but it's not a comprehensive list at all. We actually recommend keeping a checklist for quality assurance, and you can find downloadable, simple, and advanced QA checklists on the APLN, which we'll discuss in a moment. All right. And then some free tools that we recommend are Ace by Daisy for reviewing accessibility conformance, alt text, outlines, and accessibility metadata, and Sigil for inspecting or editing EPUB coding and previewing the ebook, EPUB Checker, which is a validation tool which checks if your EPUB is well formed. Thorium Reader is an ebook screen reader with a read aloud function. It's good for testing alt text, table of contents, landmarks, etc. Adobe Digital Editions is also an ebook reader, but it shows a page list in addition to table of contents and landmarks. And then Color Contrast Analyzer is a tool for checking text and image contrast as per WCAG requirements. So these are all free tools that are really great to implement in your workflow, whether you work with a third-party conversion vendor or if you're doing in-house production. Okay, so the Accessible Publishing Learning Network, it was launched by eBOUND last year in the fall, and it has some really great resources for beginners to intermediate to advanced level publishing professionals. We have resources for ebook production, InDesign to EPUB, audiobook production, image descriptions, metadata, website accessibility, digital marketing, and strategic planning. So for example, for ebook production, you can check out the ebook workflow guide for in-house production of born accessible ebooks, and you'll have details of how to implement this workflow and the steps you can take to create accessible books. And I think this is the article that has the word template for Microsoft Word. And let's see. And if you filter by checklist, you can find all articles that have downloadable checklists, for example, quality assurance of completed ebooks. So you can find simple checklists as well as an advanced checklist, and you can download them at the bottom over here. And the APLN also has a community hub, which is really great for asking questions and having discussions about all things accessible publishing. You can check out the already existing forum topics, but you do have to sign up as a registered user to post on the community hub. And we also encourage you to sign up for our newsletter to stay up to date with the latest accessibility resources and any news. But yes, this is something we highly recommend for beginners especially. And I will hand it over to Elizabeth.
Great. Thank you. So I'm just going to give a little bit of an overview about the Benetech certification process. So this is a global certified accessible program that was developed to set international standards in accessibility. So it started in the US, and we have been certifying publishers in Canada, and it's also has been certifying publishers overseas. So it's an international set of standards. The certification certifies born accessible workflow, so the actual workflow rather than individual EPUBs. So this encourages publishers to produce born accessible EPUBs on an ongoing basis, and it's less time consuming than having to go back into an EPUB to add these features after the fact. So we're hoping to get this accessibility features added from the very beginning of production. So the certification reviews EPUBs against EPUB Accessibility 1.1 and WCAG 2.2 AA standards. So how this works is that publishers are assigned a certifier, and they would review up to 3 EPUBs with a mix of manual and automated checks. A report is shared with the publisher outlining each accessibility check and specific code examples for how to add these features in. Once certification is granted, then an annual spot check completes every year after, just to make sure that EPUBs are meeting standards on an ongoing basis. So Benetech also certified vendors. So this just means that the vendors produce EPUBs that meet Benetech standards. eBOUND works only with Benetech certified vendors. So if you're interested in learning more about who these vendors are, feel free to reach out to us after the presentation. Okay, so we are going to call on Bruce Keith, our digital publishing specialist at Orca. So Bruce, are you here?
I am, yeah.
Great. Nice to see you.
Yeah, I missed the first 5 minutes because my link was bad.
Oh no, I saw a lot of people coming in. Well, thanks for joining us. So as some of you may know, Orca has a born accessible workflow. They are Benetech certified. So Bruce, could you give us some background on that process? Do you prepare the EPUBs in-house, or do you outsource? And how long it took to set this up?
How long? It's a long time. It's going to keep going. I started at Orca in October of last year. And I was hired to sort of clean up the processes, get the certification, and start producing and remediating ebooks. Orca has 3 basic streams of books. They have fiction, which is either not illustrated or lightly illustrated. They've got highly illustrated nonfiction books and picture books. The picture books right now are fixed, and they're not Benetech certifiable. The fiction, up until probably the next week or 2, are being produced out of house through eBOUND. But I'm hoping literally in the next week or 2 to bring that in-house. And then the nonfiction I do in-house. The process has been long. It's mostly been the nonfiction, because the nonfiction are really complicated. They had alt text involved with them. They have upwards of 100 images in each book, highly stylized, highly graphically interesting. And so what we had to do is we started with the designers. We went back to them, explained to them that all those fancy little tools in InDesigns like styles, object styles, character styles are really important, that there is now somebody downstream of them that is working with these files. Because as a designer, I used to be a book designer, and you were the last person to touch it, so you didn't really have to worry about cleaning up after yourself. So we had a series of discussions for that. Then we had a bunch of discussions with the people that source images and collect them and do all the rights management and everything about starting to work on alt text. Talks with management about building alt text into the contracts for both the illustrators and the authors. And then it was working with the people on the other end, the proofers, so that we had a system for them to come through. Even though I was doing the books and I knew what I was doing, I still make typos, I still forget elements. And so we had to educate all the proofers so that they could start proofreading the work that I was doing and making sure that I was getting my code right and there wasn't any errors being introduced. And then the last thing was developing standards. We're at a point right now where pretty much everything is templated. I have templates for how I want the code to look, how the files are supposed to be named, how the individual files within an EPUB are supposed to be named. And because of that now, standard CSS for the main sections, standard OPF templates. So yeah, it's ongoing. We should be getting the first alt text from authors probably in the next season, so January. We hired an intern over the summer to go through and start writing alt text for our backlist, as well as to develop an alt text style guide, which has been a godsend now because we can start sending that out to authors and illustrators. And yeah, and then the last thing for me is I really enjoy using Python for search and replaces. And so I've started to develop a long series of Python scripts that, so when something comes out of InDesign as an EPUB file, I can just run it through a series of scripts and it cleans up all the stuff, does search and replaces all the rejects and everything, and gives me a really clean file to start working on.
Great. Thank you for that. So I wanted to go back on the alt text creation from authors and illustrators. So how was the feedback from them? Were they pretty resistant to include this, or were they pretty open, or?
I had to talk to Georgia about this. She said it was mixed, right? That everybody off the bat wants to do it. It is something most of them believe in, and they want to continue doing, but timing becomes a real problem. And it's one of the reasons why it's taken us so long. So we've got 4 authors right now, I think, writing their own alt text, and then working with Georgia to clean it up and make it according to the standards that we want. The illustrators right now are not writing the alt text, but what they're doing is they're providing illustration notes. So all the notes that they have with the designers, all the intentions that they want from the various illustrations. So we're getting that, and then we'll turn that into notes. And I hope that once we start from scratch, that it'll all smooth out a little bit. I mean, the people that are writing alt text right now are sort of doing it in media res, right? They'd already started working on their books before they'd ever heard of alt text. But no, I across the board, everybody's happy to do it. It's just the extra work.
Great, that's great to hear. So have there been any challenges when you were setting up the Born Accessible workflow, or is it just more of a time commitment?
Dealing with the designers was a bit of a challenge, because again, they don't quite understand what happens next. And I was quite surprised that most of them don't bother to go look at what the external people were doing to their ebooks or to their books as they transform them into ebooks. The alt text generation, there were a lot of discussions around inclusivity. Wow, I can't say that word. Languages, how far we were going to go. Orca has a real standard for trying to have as much inclusiveness as possible in their images, but in most cases, especially when we're using stock photography, something wasn't chosen because somebody was Black or somebody was a Muslim person. So developing those rules, right? So generally we don't include that sort of stuff in the alt text unless it was an indigenous book, in which case we specifically wanted to mention, the specifics. Tracking changes and proofing was a challenge at the first, to make sure that we knew what books had been done, what elements had been done to what book, what standards had been set, because it's been an evolution all the way through. And then color contrast, and surprisingly, that has probably been the biggest single problem, because most of the books that were coming out of the InDesign files were not, they weren't up to standards in color contrast. So then I had to go through and invent new colors, which then, yellows and oranges are really bad, so they look really ugly. And so there were conversations back and forth. I was really surprised that covers had to also meet the contrast standards. And so that is also, I've had to go in sometimes and do a little Photoshop work on some of the smaller type on covers. But, it's working really well. I mean, there'll be challenges, and probably by the time we're through, an entire 4-year cycle, we'll have met most of them.
Yeah. So how does your process change when you're working with someone who's outsourcing your EPUB? Could you said that some of your books are being outsourced? So are
Yeah,
you?
well, just the fiction, and what happens at that point is we send out, if the alt text for the covers have been written, that goes out. The books come back, and then it takes me